This meeting is being recorded.
All right, thank you. We have a quorum, Mayor Bennett.
Thank you. I'll call this meeting in order. Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. This meeting is being live streamed. We ask everybody to press *6 on your phones if you're calling in to mute or unmute yourself. As permitted by the governor's disaster declaration dated Friday, March 31st, determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent to this board. To ensure a transparent and open meeting as possible, the meeting materials were posted approximately 1 week in advance. A recording of this meeting will be provided and linked to our website, and all votes will be taken by roll call. Aaron, call the roll, please.
Great, thank you. Mayor Bennett?
Present.
Frank Beal?
Present.
President Brawley?
Present.
Mayor Darch?
Present.
Paul Goodrich?
Here.
Jim Healy? Nina Idamudia?
Here.
Mayor Noak?
Here.
President Reinbold?
Here.
Mayor Rodering?
Here.
Stefan Schaefer? Carolyn Schofield?
Here.
Ann Sheehan? Matt Walsh?
Present.
Diane Williams?
Present.
Leanne Redden?
Here.
And Chorus Muhammad Adian.
Present.
Thank you. We have a quorum, everyone. Welcome a little bit late. I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes of actually February 8th. Is there a motion?
So move. This is Diane.
Second. No.
Moved and seconded. Aaron, call the roll.
Mayor Bennett?
Aye.
Frank Beal?
Yes.
President Brawley?
Yes.
Mayor Darch?
Yes.
Paul Goodrich?
Yes.
Jim Healy? Nina Idamudia?
Yes.
Mayor Noak?
Yes.
President Reinbold?
Yes.
Mayor Rodering?
Yes.
Stefan Schaefer? Carolyn Schofield?
Yes.
Ann Sheehan? Matt Walsh?
Yes.
Diane Williams?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion carries. Next item on the agenda is the Executive Director's Report. Aaron.
Good morning. My report this morning is pretty short because I've got a couple items towards the end of the agenda, but you know, it is a beautiful day, and I think on sunny, beautiful days, it's a nice thing to remember people who have had an impact on our lives and our community and our region. So I am unfortunately starting with a somber note today. I know many of you know that Western Springs and our entire region lost a great leader recently. President Alice Gallagher passed away unexpectedly, and her fellow trustee said that her leadership was more than a profession, it was her calling, and I think we couldn't agree more. She served in many roles and cared deeply about serving people. She was on CMAP's Council of Mayors Executive Committee. She served as Vice President of West Central Municipal Conference, and she also served as President of the Central Council of Mayors and Chair of the Council's Transportation Committee. So, you know, I know the sad news and passing came as a shock to many, but on behalf of the CMAP family, we wanted to just express our sincere condolences. She'll be missed.
Thanks, Aaron. She was a great lady, and she really is going to be missed. In fact, I think she was going to be next year the president of the West Central. So that was really a shame and a loss for that region.
It is. It is. You know, getting back to our agenda, though, we do have a number of items on the agenda this month, given the fact that we weren't able to make a meeting happen last month. I do want to remind you all that on May 10th, our board meeting will be our last virtual meeting. Starting the next day, all public bodies in Illinois will be required to hold in-person meetings under the Open Meetings Act. This will be the date that the state's disaster declaration will be rescinded. So a quorum of the members will need to be physically present. Our quorum is 12 of our 15 voting members here. Under OMA, if a quorum of the members of the public body is physically present, then we can request virtual participation if the situation meets conditions outlined in OMA and our bylaws. So again, this request would need to be approved by the majority of our board, but again, we'll be back to very stringent requirements. And I know, Mayor Bennett, you've expressed that we don't want to waste people's time coming downtown if we don't have a quorum. So please make sure that you communicate with us. But next month May will be virtual. And then we typically take, June will be in person, and then we take July and August off should we have no business or pressing procurements. So in line with our vision and mission and values here at CMAP, we will continue to allow for public participation virtually. On your agenda today, we will be asking for your approval of an updated public participation policy for our bylaws here today. The last item that I wanted to mention too is that we made note of the fact that our October joint meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, October 11th, does overlap with Metra and PACE's board meetings. So we will be actively working with the board, the MPO, to see if we can find an alternative date, maybe later in that day, to convene, because we will be with, we hope to be approving recommendations for the plan of action for regional transit report. So I just wanted you all to be aware of the fact that ask will be coming as well. With that, that concludes my report. I think we'll want to move on to item 5.0, procurements and contract awards.
Can we announce that this meeting is being held in alignment with the governor's disaster declaration that allows us to hold meetings virtually?
Thank you very much, Blanca, for that reminder. As permitted by the governor's disaster declaration dated Friday, May 31st, the determination
I think I read that.
made, I think, well, yes. So, but that we'll go ahead and make sure that we did make sure that materials were posted a week in advance, and a recording of the meeting will be made available to the public. So, all right, item 5.0, Mayor Bennett, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, thanks. Because we did not meet last month, we do have 6 items on the agenda for procurements and contracts. Well, it's in front of you. I don't have to read them. Hopefully you have. And I guess I'll entertain a motion that we accept those contract procurements. Entertain a motion for the.
Moved, Reinbold.
We had a first by President Reinbold.
Second by Walsh.
Moved and seconded. Again, these are 6 items that you were given prior. Any questions on those items? If not, Aaron, call the roll, please.
Thank you, Mayor Bennett.
Aye.
Frank Beal,
Yes.
President Brawley,
Yes.
Mayor Darch,
Yes.
Paul Goodrich,
Yes.
Jim Healy, Nina Itamudia,
Aye.
Mayor Noak,
yes,
President Reinbold,
Yes.
Mayor Rotering,
Aye.
Stephen Schaefer, Carolyn Schofield,
Yes.
Ann Sheehan, Matt Walsh,
Yes.
Diane Williams.
Yes.
The motion carries. Thank you, Walt. Moving on to item 6, it's a presentation, a brief presentation of our financial audit. Peter, you're there, right?
Let's see, good. Is Peter on this morning? If
We're waiting for tickets.
there we go. Now we can hear you.
Yeah,
Yep, I'm here, Peter.
perfect. Hey, Jim. So, yeah, so Jim, and I don't know if Martha's on from Sickich as well, but if Jim is here, Jim, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Peter. Thanks everyone for your time here today. Also, just want to start by thanking Aaron and Peter and the entire staff for all of their assistance and professionalism through the entire audit. We really do appreciate it. What I'll do, Martha presented at the executive committee, so I'll give you a little bit of an abridged version of that presentation. Then be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So the first thing I'll do is go through the annual financial report in the table of contents, just to kind of give you an idea of what's in the report. I think the report's in the packet agenda. We start off with the independent auditor's report, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. That's on pages 1 through 4. Management discussion and analysis, I will also touch on real briefly. After that, in the report are the basic financial statements. So that's the main financial statements, the statement of net position of your balance sheet, statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net position, your income statement, a statement of cash flows. Then on the notes to the financial statements are on pages 8 through 33, a lot of additional information that kind of supports those basic financial statements and should be read in conjunction with them. After that is what we call required supplementary information, or RSI. So there's some additional information on your participation in the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund, as well as the State Employees Retirement Fund. After that is some supplementary information. The first two schedules I'll just mention real briefly. That there's a good budget versus actual schedule on page 40, and then a schedule of grant receipts, expenses, and balances. It's a good summary of the grant activity for the year. So that's a really nice and informative schedule. And then at the end is the single audit information. Since you expend more than $750,000 in federal funds, you're required to have a single audit. So you'll see the first opinion is on page 48 and 49, what we typically call the yellow book audit. After that's our report on compliance for each of the major federal programs and on internal control over compliance required by uniform guidance. That's on pages 50 through 52. After that's the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, which is the schedule of all the federal awards that you have expended through the fiscal year. Some notes after that, and then schedule of findings and questions costs. I'll go through that real briefly because that's a really good summary of our reports. So the first thing I'll talk about in the annual financial report is the independent auditor's report. So this year we did implement some new auditing standards. So you may notice a little bit different content, a little bit different format in the independent auditor's report. The first thing you may notice is that the opinion paragraphs are now at the very beginning of the report. So they typically were buried kind of in the middle of the report. So those are right at the beginning, and you'll see the second paragraph is our opinion paragraph. Again, we issued an unmodified opinion, which is the highest level of assurance that we can provide to the agency. One other thing I'll point out here on page 1, the very last paragraph, change in accounting principle. We did implement a new auditing standard that was accounting standard that was fairly significant, GASB 87, related to leases. So that required us to record an intangible asset and then an offsetting liability for your office lease. So that was a fairly significant amount. And there's additional information on that in footnotes 3 and 11. Page 2 of the independent auditor's report. I want to talk about the third paragraph, the auditor's responsibilities for the audit of the financial statements. So that very first paragraph under that section. There's some new language here, so I'll go through that real briefly. You'll see the first sentence, the objective is to obtain reasonable assurance about whether the financial statements as a whole.
Jim, somehow you got muted here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So yeah, page 2 of the independent auditor's report, third paragraph, just want to go through that real briefly. Like I said, the first sentence, our objective is to obtain reasonable assurance about whether the financial statements as a whole are free from material misstatement, either due to fraud or error, and to issue our reports. It goes on to say that reasonable assurance, it's a high level of assurance, but it's not absolute assurance. We don't look at every single transaction. So there's a chance that an audit may not detect a material misstatement. It goes on to say that obviously trying to detect fraud is much more difficult than trying to detect an error because there's collusion, forgery, management, override of controls, etc. And then the last sentence, misstatements are considered material if there's a substantial likelihood that individually or in the aggregate, they would influence the judgment made by a reasonable user of the financial statement. So materiality does come into play, and there's some judgment involved with that. The last thing I'll talk about in the independent auditor's report is on page 3 under other matters. So this kind of tells you an explanation of kind of the procedures we performed on these specific areas. So the required supplementary information, we do some limited procedures. We read the information, perform inquiries with management, but not enough to give an opinion on that information. And then the supplementary information listed in the table of contents, we give an in relation to opinion on that. So in relation to the basic financial statements, they're not materially misstated. I will talk real briefly then about the management discussion and analysis. I kind of point this out every year. Great overview of the agency's financial position and changes in financial position. highlights any significant changes or trends that may have occurred during the year. Also has some 3-year comparative data that you can't find elsewhere in the report. So I really recommend and encourage you to read the MD&A because, like I said, it provides a good overview of the agency's finances. I'm going to move on to the statement of net position. This is your balance sheet. This is on financial statement page 5. And I just want to point out real quick the changes due to that implementation of GASB 87 related to leases. On page 5, you'll notice up at the top under long-term assets, you'll see that very last line, intangible assets net of accumulated amortization. That's the intangible asset for your right to use the office space downtown. And then offsetting that is in the current liabilities in the long-term liabilities section. So in each of those sections, there's the last line item in each section is called leases. So that's the liability related to your payments that you need to make on those leases. And then net position down at the bottom, that's kind of your retained earnings, your retained earnings for the year. You'll see that net investment in capital assets decreased slightly, and then unrestricted increased about 1.2 million. And then the very next statement is a statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net position. So this is your income statement. Again, I'll just point out the changes for GASB 87. Under operating expenses, you'll see that amortization expense. So that's your amortization of that intangible lease for the year. And then interest expense related to the leases is in the non-operating revenues expenses section, that second line item right there. And then the change in that position this year was about $923,000. And the last thing I'll point out in the annual financial report is all the way in on pages 56 and 57. This is where I talked about those schedule of findings and question costs. Really good summary of our reports and what we found. So you'll see it's broken out by financial statements up at the top. Like I said, we gave an unmodified opinion. You'll see in a minute, we didn't have any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, and there were no material issues of non-compliance. The federal awards results, again, no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies. We issued an unmodified opinion on the 2 major programs that we had this year. And then we had no audit findings as well. And then down at the bottom, you did qualify as a low risk auditee. And then finally, page 57, you'll see our findings. We didn't have any findings this year or last year. So that's all I had on the annual financial report. I'll go through the board communication report real quickly. And I'll go through the table of contents for that. That's the auditor's communication to the members of the board. We have required communication that we have to have with those charged with governance every year. That's on pages 2 through 4. We did communicate that we implemented GASB 87. Otherwise, pretty routine communication. Didn't have any disagreements or difficulties with management at all. So pretty routine language there. After that, we list out our adjusting journal entries. These are audit entries we found as part of the audit process. So we're required to communicate those to you. We had 4 entries on page 5, 2 of them related to our assistance with helping you implement GASB 87. And we also had no, what we call, excuse me, past adjusting journal entries. So these would be entries that were deemed to be immaterial, so we didn't record them. We didn't have any of those. So everything that we felt needed to be adjusted was adjusted. And then the management letter starts on page 7. And what this page 7 states in writing is that we had no material weaknesses, like I mentioned previously. Again, no significant deficiencies and no deficiencies as well. So great job by Peter and his team. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions regarding the audit? Other than to say thank you, and more importantly, just thank you to staff. With the size of our budget and the incredible amount of funds that come in from different sources, and to maintain the level of transparency and really excellence in tracking it. And you can see from the audit report that there have been no major deficiencies. Again, any questions? I will ask for a motion to technically receive the audit and have the board approve that audit report. Is there a motion?
Motion by Noak.
Second, George.
Moved and seconded. Aaron, call the roll.
Mayor Bennett,
Aye.
Frank Beal,
Aye.
President Brawley,
Aye.
Mayor Darch,
Aye.
Paul Goodrich,
Aye.
Jim Healy,
Aye.
Nina Itamudia,
Aye.
Mayor Noak,
Aye.
President Reinbold,
Yes.
Mayor Rotering. Aye. Stefan Schaefer, Carolyn Schofield,
Yes.
Ann Sheehan, Matt Walsh,
Yes.
Diane Williams.
Yes.
And the motion carries. Thank you all. Next item is what Aaron had briefly talked about, and that's a public participation policy. Aaron?
Yeah, so thanks. We've been working with our attorneys to make sure that we are ready to re-engage in normal board meetings, but the pandemic has shown us that there is a desire and some benefit for the public participating virtually in our meetings. So again, this is sort of tightening up our public participation policy in our bylaws, and was recommended that we go ahead and make a few formal adjustments just to have these policies on hand as we move into past the disaster declaration's expiration. I'm happy to answer any questions if the board has questions about the policy.
Yeah, no need for a motion. It's just a change in procedure or policy. No
That-
questions?
You know what? Yeah, change in policy, but does need approval.
It does or doesn't? I don't see it on the agenda. But if you want a motion, that's fine.
I do believe we need a motion and
We do need a motion.
Okay, I'll entertain a motion to approve that policy then.
So moved. Noak.
Second, Diane.
Moved and seconded. Aaron, call the roll.
thank you. Mayor Bennett,
Aye.
Frank Beal,
Aye.
President Brawley.
Aye.
Mayor Darch,
Aye.
Paul Goodrich,
Aye.
Jim Healy,
Aye.
Nina Itamudia,
Aye.
Mayor Noak,
Aye.
President Reinbold,
Yes.
Mayor Rotering. Aye. Stefan Schaefer, Carolyn Schofield,
Yes.
Ann Sheehan, Matt Walsh,
Yes.
and Diane Williams.
Yes.
And the motion carries. Thank you. Next item is executive session, and we're going to do this last month, but unfortunately we didn't have a meeting. But in viewing the recommendation from our legal counsel that the council wants, we can go into, or the board wants to go into exec session, but basically there's going to be a recommendation to release the closed session minutes from a list that we were given. And with that recommendation, apparently there's no problem in releasing it. So if the board wishes, we can just go on for a motion to release those dates cited in the minutes or in your agenda, and just go straight ahead with a motion unless there's an objection, you want to go into exec session. So if there's no objection.
Make that motion, having reviewed the recommendations of council.
Thank you, Mayor.
Seconded. I will second.
Moved and seconded, and the motion again is to release the, based upon council's recommendation, the executive session minutes for the various dates that are on the agenda. Any questions on those? Clerk. Aaron, you want to call the roll?
Clerk, Aaron, that's fine. Yes, happy to. Mayor Bennett,
It's out of habit, yes.
Frank Beal,
Yes.
President Brawley,
Yes.
Mayor Darch,
Yes.
Paul Goodrich,
Yes.
Jim Healy,
Yes.
Nina Itamudia,
Yes.
Mayor Noak,
Yes.
President Reinbold,
Yes.
Mayor Rotering,
Yes.
Stefan Schaefer, Carolyn Schofield,
Yes.
Ann Sheehan, Matt Walsh,
Yes.
Diane Williams.
Yes.
And the motion carries. Thank you. We'll then move on to our next items. The next couple items are important information. So I'll start off with Laura. You want to give the presentation and the plan of action for the park program?
Yeah, and I'll just butt in here and say that that was a editing note for us. It's actually going to be Bill Barnes, Deputy of Regional Policy and Implementation, giving this presentation this morning. So we'll turn it over.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
My bad. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Bill Barnes, Deputy Regional Policy and Implementation. And as Mayor Bennett pointed out, you're used to seeing Laura in this spot, but she's on a much deserved vacation right now. So I'm going to take up her mantle and, advise you what happened since we last spoke about the PART process, the plan of action for regional transit. So as you all know, the General Assembly has tasked CMAP with conducting a study to assess our transit system's future operations and funding needs, which is due to them by the end of this year. We officially launched the effort in January with the help of a steering committee, and we've also been subject matter specific discussion groups and have engaged with stakeholders from across the region to inform and champion this report. It's important to note that we're also meeting regularly with PACE, Metra, CTA, and RTA as the work continues to move forward. So at our last meeting, we discussed initial scopes and the approach to this task, which laid the ground for the research and the engagement that is now well underway. So today, I'm here to give you an update on where we are in this process and discuss some preliminary policy recommendations that have emerged from these conversations. So to reset, remember that we've organized this process under 3 focus areas. One, how to pay for it, and then how to implement it. Next slide, please. So in the system we want area, this is essentially considering improvements to rebuild public confidence and ensure seamless access to all of the modes offered by regional mass transit. So essentially, we're looking at how can we improve transit for the users of this system? What can we do to incentivize people to ride? And then also to support the travel of those who have continued to ride transit over the past 3 pandemic-ridden years. So among the focus areas we're looking at here are better buses. So on your homework assignment, we're focusing on how we can make buses faster, more frequent, and more reliable throughout the region, and how all of the region's transportation agencies can support that. Not just the transit agencies, but also those agencies that own and maintain the roads that the buses rely upon. We're also looking at ensuring that it's universally accessible, both through physical investments like ramps, elevators, and sidewalk connections, and also technology investments that can make the system easier to access for everyone. We're also addressing potential operational efficiencies. We want to make sure that the system pursues goals like bus electrification, which is important to so many of our stakeholders, and that transit provides so efficiently and without compromising existing service levels. And then also there's the issue that's been on top of mind for everyone so lately. We're considering concerns related to the safety and security of the system to respond to the real challenges facing transit and the perception held by the public. Next slide, please. When looking at the system we want, we're looking at more than just the system and its assets. We're also thinking about how we can use that system to seamlessly and affordably connect travelers throughout the region. So in your other homework video, we shared some of the challenges and opportunities we're pursuing on the more and affordable transit fares. Things like discounted transfers from Metra to CTA and PACE, fare subsidies for travelers with limited incomes, and the roles that fares play in overall transit funding, which we'll discuss in a little bit. Affordability is, of course, top of mind, and that builds on the ongoing work at Cook County Transit Pilot Project. We're also looking at other topics that extend throughout the region. The evolution of Metra towards a regional rail model, which serves to better meet the new travel patterns throughout the region, and how to use land use and development to support transit's recovery, because we know that there are strong intersection issues and transit's long-term successes and financial sustainability. Next slide, please. In the How to Implement It group, we're tasked with reforming governance structures and funding distribution mechanisms, topics which span the other groups and their deliverables. So first off is consideration of the public funds. As we identify new funding sources and streams, we must also consider the historical ways that they have been distributed and how we can improve upon that. System governance as a whole is a broad topic. It's one that considers the existing frameworks, process, and procedures for managing transit responsibilities. We're going to dive a little deeper later and explore the overarching challenges which will frame this group's ultimate recommendations. And then there's the fare box recovery ratio, a performance metric which requires at least 50% of transit's operating budget be comprised of system-generated revenues, and it's also up for consideration. Should it be reduced? Should it be replaced? Or should it be? Those are things that are up for consideration. Next slide. The bulk of today's discussion is going to concern an update on the ongoing work to understand opportunities to meet the urgent financial needs of the region's transit system. How are we going to pay for this gap? So in light of the legislative mandate and the time constraints that we're faced with, our work is focused on reforms and funding solutions that can, one, close the operating budget shortfall that's looming in 2026, while also paying for the system improvements identified for the broader PART process. There are several elements to this, including ideas on how to capture new revenues, like local revenues from sources like taxes and tolls, new transit system revenue from fare increases and other means, new federal funding services, paratransit, reduction or replacement of the existing fare box recovery ratio, and it's important to note opportunities for structural and operational savings. And I saved this for last because the presentation is going to talk about new revenue. It's important to emphasize that we've heard a high level of interest from many of you and other stakeholders of the need to identify savings that are within the control of the service boards themselves. To that end, we're working closely with the service boards to assess detailed cost trends over time and identify for achieving operational efficiencies. We do anticipate, as we mentioned the last time, that savings of some kind will be an element of the overall revenue package. But this is not a situation we can cut our way out of. New operational revenues will need to be a part of, and probably the majority of, whatever final package we have. Next slide, please. So before we discuss potential funding alternatives, it's important to understand the broader funding context. This slide projects regional funding trends from 2020 through an anticipated 2031. And it helps you to understand the basic components for regional transit. In blue, you see state and regional funding, which is essentially taxes, namely the sales tax. Operational revenues are shown in green, and federal funds, which make up the shortfall created by a decrease in fares, begins in 2020 and then runs out 2025, where the shortfall is identified in red. Simply put, the fiscal cliff is caused by operational revenues being outpaced by operational costs. Telework has driven down ridership, which translates into decreased fare receipts. Service providers have reduced fares to encourage ridership, and operational costs are increasing through labor shortages, labor costs, and inflation. So the importance here is to identify the onset of the funding gap, which begins as an estimated $245 million in 2025 and grows to an estimated $1 billion by 2030. Next slide. This slide takes a little deeper dive into the nuances of transit funding with a comparison of a pre-pandemic 2019 budget to the current 2023 budget on the bottom. Parsing out the individual sources of operation funding, we see in green, system-generated revenues, which are largely the fares, which can be impacted by the pandemic. And per the fare box recovery ratio, should be 50% of operating costs. In light blue, you see the RTA sales tax. Currently, that's 1.25% in Cook County, and in the 5 suburban counties, it's 0.5%. Dark blue is the public transportation fund with state funding match of 30% of the RTA sales tax and the real estate transfer tax that was imposed on the city of Chicago in 2008. The real estate transfer tax is shown in it's sort of a sickly yellow. And then state funding to reimburse our specific debt service is showed as well as federal funding in purple, for 2023, which comprises 21% of the 2023 budget. The takeaway here, sales tax is the largest public funding source for regional transit. Next slide, please. So in the first three of the How to Pay For It discussion group, we again focused on two priorities: exploring all cost savings and efficiencies within the RTA and Service Board control, and second, the generation of new public revenues. So what have these discussions entail? Well, we've taken a hard look at historical operating expenses, debt management practices, implement cost savings. These conversations continue and will help drive the recommendations that we bring to this board. We're also starting to explore the cost of labor as a share of the total expenses and cost growth over time. And we're learning more about what is driving cost growth over time and how much debt is drawing down our revenues. The general consensus is that the RTA and service boards need to do as much as possible to explore ways to reduce the operating gap on their own before they can count on more public revenues. But savings alone cannot fill the anticipated hole. Stable funding, additional stable funding is definitely needed. So, standpoint, we're learning from past experiences, namely, the impacts and effects of the 2008 reforms that followed a previous transit budget crisis. We're trying to understand why these reforms did not create the financial sustainability for the system that folks may have intended at that time. We're identifying pitfalls of those reforms, and we're doing our best to ensure that we don't end up in the same place with another crisis 15 years from now. We're also cognizant of transportation funding for transportation's sake, meaning transit and transportation are inextricably linked, so we need to look at transportation funding as a whole. And that sort of feeds into this notion, which is by the sponsoring legislators, of the fact that we need to be bold in our solution. So all forms of public revenues are on the table for consideration as we move forward. Next slide, please. So speaking of the spectrum of public funding solutions that are up for consideration, this is a handy chart from the RT plan, which identifies a suite of possible solutions to address the funding gap, all of which are on the table for discussion and consideration. But notably, all of these solutions come with their own unique costs and benefits, from ease of administration to delays in implementation, political impacts, anticipated revenues, and the like. Next slide, please. So when proposing a solution to the current funding challenges, it's important that we scrutinize historical funding trends. Doing so can help us identify underlying problems with the existing system. So here we provide an overview of transit revenue sources over time, adjusted for inflation. So it's from 2007 on the left all the way to 2022 on the right. Fares, shown in light orange, show a market decline post-2019 when the pandemic and its impacts are felt. The red reflects the role federal stimulus funding plays to fill the operational gap created by the decrease. As we discussed previously, the largest component of revenues is sales tax and related state matches, represented in different shades of blue. You'll note a slight jump in 2008 with the influx of additional sales tax in Cook and Collier counties and the introduction of the real estate transfer tax in the city of Chicago. Again, primary takeaway here is the overarching role played by sales tax in supporting transit operations. Next slide. So speaking of the sales tax on which transit so heavily relies, it's largely based on the sale of goods and not services. So what this chart shows is the sale of goods, which we tax, is losing to services, which we largely don't tax, as a share of overall economic activity. Services have been growing as a share of household expenditures for the past 40 years, and indicator we're shifting away from a goods-based economy to a services-based economy. So to help us understand the that exist on the sales tax front, our consultant SB Friedman is educating the discussion group on the sales tax and potential pathways to better leverage the sales tax as a funding source for transit. be it a long-term or short-term solution. So this involves helping us to understand that the transit system's reliance on sales tax is a structural issue, as consumer spending on services is fast outpacing that on goods. It's helping us to consider that the sales tax landscape exists from peer and adjacent states and regions. What does our existing landscape look like compared to Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, and the like, and then also large urban regions as well. Where is there areas for growth and the like? And then as we as a group are looking forward to revenue projections on different sales tax scenarios from SB Friedman in future meetings. So what are our options? Next slide. Some of the things that are up for consideration include expanding the sales tax to certain, essentially adjusting the base, increasing the rate. So is that done on a regional basis or is that statewide? One of the things that has been brought up is reallocating the 0.25% of suburban sales tax currently set aside for county public safety and transportation needs and dedicating it to transit operations. Up for consideration, capturing locally taxed goods and services. Again, these are just options, not recommendations. But if you look in the next slide, we'd be very interested in hearing, input from this group. What issues are helpful for our team to understand as we consider potential recommendations as they're brought to us by our consultants and also discussion group members? What information would you as a larger group like in order to better make decisions about increased revenues as we move forward towards recommendation approval? And I'll just open it up. This is an opportunity for you to speak and for us to hear and take that information back, feed it into the larger process.
Thanks, Bill. If I could just, Mayor Bennett, briefly say that, I think from our perspective and the conversations we've had from you, there's no disagreement about the value of transit to our region. I think as you look at those options, none of these options are going to make anybody very happy. And that's okay, right? But it is incumbent upon us, as we were asked to by the General Assembly, consider what is going to be feasible, what is going to be palatable, where there is their consensus. And I think, again, this board representing the entirety of the region will have some helpful feedback for us. So we are looking for your critique and, and your innovation as you help us shape this report's recommendations.
Yeah, just an opening comment that the ask in a couple of these or considerations in a couple of these are really action that would have to be taken by the General Assembly, and in consideration that they asked us to do the study, if in fact one of those recommendations goes back to them on implementation of tax on services, which has been a discussion with the General Assembly now for the last X number of years about expanding the sales tax base, really throws it back in their lap, at least my observation on a couple of these recommendations, because I think for the good of the entire state and for our region, be done on a statewide basis versus just the RTA service district. Questions, comments?
I think having a little more, we don't need to micromanage the process, but understanding like where the real gaps are between the operating revenue and, you showed it in a bar chart, and the operating expenses, but some actual picture of those numbers, or what does a service tax look like, what on all services, and that's not for us to ultimately figure out, but it would be good before we make a recommendation, have some sense of actual impact. Would it be, and we expect that it would give us this much additional revenue. And I know we've got those numbers from past studies of service taxes, and then that would, fill that basic gap. What does it look like when you look at the option of increasing fares? Is someone going to look at that from the perspective of across the different, PACE, CTA, Metra? What are you paying now? And if is it going to have to be 20%? I don't know how detailed you're going to get, but I think in the end, sometimes it's easier for me to see some actual examples of what we're talking about rather than just the generic, a tax on goods or services. And I'd also want to really know some of the actual sales tax numbers. We are seeing inflation. So, although there's inflation in costs for us, we're also seeing some inflation in prices and therefore higher sales tax revenue in some areas, even though services to goods have a different place. What actually are we seeing in terms of sales tax dollars across the region? I know in some sectors for us, there've been actual fairly substantial increases. Some of that's inflation, some of it's what the product is. But anyway, so that's just a couple of random thoughts.
So if I could respond to those in order, very, very great questions and points. So where we're at in the current stage is we're working with the discussion group to better understand what the options are. So what does a sales tax look like? What does cordon pricing look like? What does vehicle miles traveled tax look like? So that they have a general understanding, and working with our consultants, we will be putting together a range of dollars that can be generated from the various sources. So, the hope is at the end of the day, Mayor Bennett, as you were saying, our audience is the General Assembly. We want to provide them with a menu of options that they can choose from. So knowing what the opportunities and costs are from each of those, and they can pick and choose the solutions that they see fit. Another moving target that we're working on right now is, what is the hole that we need to fill? There are estimates of the operating gap from the transit agencies that exist and that are being refined over time, but we also have the costs of the improvements that we are looking to make to transit to bring people back and to encourage transit ridership will also increase the dollar amount that we need to come up with. So as that solidifies and we understand what we need to solve for, those numbers will come into view and will crystallize on what those look like. And then to your point as to sales tax, yes, in our studies of sales tax, we've seen that sales tax have increased due to online purchasing driven by the pandemic. But again, there's an underlying systemic concern with the fact that it's so heavily reliant upon goods when we see so much growth in the service sector. So that's why we're also looking for opportunities in the service side.
I'd also like to see where throughout the region these revenue projections are coming from. Are there clusters? Where is the revenue coming from? What percentage of each area does each revenue source generate? It would be nice to know how this is spread around.
Thanks for highlighting that, Mayor. I wanted to jump in also and say on behalf of Lake County, the fare box recovery question, if it's a straight line of cost to revenues, I think we're going to have a huge issue. We obviously are even more dependent on having transit available. We are still suffering, I think, in some areas as being a transit desert, and have had some questions recently about whether lines were going to be reduced because of the lack of fare box recovery. So essentially making the problem worse just by virtue of our volume differences compared to Chicago, for example. Thanks.
Jim?
I'm wondering if the numbers have been massaged yet. You talked about operational savings and things of that nature. Because of the decrease in ridership, have the numbers that are included in your report included the reductions in the number of buses on a certain line or things of that nature, or is it just looking at the budget as it is today versus revenues as it is today? And eventually someday the two numbers will come in as to what the operational savings are that you're looking at will entail.
Well, a great question. We're looking at the budgets as they exist today, but we're also, to your point, the landscape has changed, and service does not look like what it looked like when they put out the budget in 2022 or earlier this year. So, and that affects the amount of the operation. So we are working with the service boards to better understand how their evolution over the past 3 years impacts the gap and drives their operational costs. So it's something that we are in constant contact with the transit boards about. Understand truly what we're solving for.
Right, because I think that's what a lot of the people who are going to eventually make this decision are going to want to know is, based upon the fact that COVID and the telecommunications section, everybody working from home is going to have on public transit, and then how is that going to relate in how they operate, and whether that then includes some operational savings, so that the real dollar amount we're looking to replace is X. And right now we have a kind of an X plus whatever it's going to be for the operational savings. So I just wanted to say that I know after hearing some of this presentation with the Cook and Collier County chairmans and president and executive, that afterwards, many of them had that specific question as to, well, what is the final dollar amount we're looking to try and replace, because we don't really have that, because we don't have the operational savings yet or changes.
Right. Does the funding gap mean returning to 2019? We're not at 2019 service levels.
Correct. In other words, is the amount we're looking to try and replace 250 million, or because of reduced ridership, or after operational savings, it's 150 million? I mean, those are the first questions that a lot of people are going to ask.
Very good points.
And I think you're right. That's the question that's being asked. And I think after having conversations with RTA and the service boards as well, our region's transit agencies are incredibly efficient if you look at their cost per ride basis compared to some of our other major metropolitan peers. And so, the operational savings may not be all of that great, and given the compounding effect of the fact that if you cut service, right, but you still have garages that you need to maintain, and facilities and buses that you need to maintain, the cuts have to be pretty draconian in order to achieve that 20% operations gap. So it would be nice to sort of draw a straight line between operational savings and being able to fill that gap. I think we're in a situation where I'm just not sure that it's going to be.
Well, I'm not naive enough to think that there's going to be a straight linear line between the savings and operational and the need for additional revenues. As a big proponent of public transit, since I was in college studying it up in Toronto and across the globe, I believe that there is a need for it, and there's probably a need for a new funding mechanism or an enhanced funding mechanism of it. But I saw very clearly that many of the decision makers are asking the first question, which I think most elected officials are looking at, which is, what is the final idea of what the budget will be? And we have to realize there has been a dramatic, in your charts even show that, a dramatic change in the use of public transit in the United States and also in this region after COVID, and with the number of people who are finding that they can work from home, 4 days a week and only have to go in the office 1 day a week. So I don't know what that is. I mean, each service board is going to have to make those determinations themselves as to what their operation is going to look like. But I think that's where you also need to be moving this along very quickly, because then after you know what your deficit is, then you can look at what you need to enhance, and where the easiest way to enhance that is, which is, I guess the point that the chairmans and the president and the executive were making when we had that meeting in DuPage County.
Yeah.
And I'd also add that with those changes, are there needs for new investments to accommodate the new usage patterns that may be occurring with more stay at home and with different patterns emerging? It's not to say that people aren't going to use transit anymore. They may just be using them in different ways and in impacting different parts of our region and disproportionately. The other thing I brought up during one of our interviews and discussions is the fact that there has always been a large amount of transit activities occurring that are not run by the transit agencies, but are rather provided oftentimes, especially throughout the suburbs, by townships, municipalities, park districts of all unsubsidized, that are basically subsidizing the transit agencies already. And that's and is there increased demands and costs on those because of these changes as well.
Mayor, that's a good point. I think even to Mayor Roddering's point that, there's a macro and a micro here. The macro, obviously, with the central city being the city of Chicago and the bulk of cost and or availability of movement from the suburbs or counties to the city is one thing, but what about, on a micro level, what's happening in the counties or in the suburban areas on the need for potential increase of that or support of what's existing going forward. So I think, and Jim brought it up too, is certainly the where's the future going? Do we really know right now, or are we in a transitional period coming from COVID that will return? I can't answer that, and that's going to be driven a lot by the business community. Again, on a macro level downtown in Chicago, where a bulk of that is. And the other question too is that if it's not going to change, do you chicken and egg? Do you cut back service to reduce costs, and then they won't travel anymore because of the convenience? And you continue to hear that about, the right now, even with the CTA and some of the other agencies that, well, it's you don't have enough trains or you don't have enough buses to make it convenient for me to go from A to B. So again, it's a chicken and egg thing that's going on. But throw in COVID and now and there is a lot to be to understand and to learn and going forward. So.
Can I also add a comment there? I hope RTA is also looking into actually just optimizing the services and network of transit in light of lots of changes that have happened in the past decade. Bike sharing, micromobility options, and widespread of use of ride sharing. And bringing these actually just in conjunction in collaboration with transit services, not necessarily cutting from services, but also trying to optimize the routes, combining some of the routes and just services. So I'm hoping that RT also looks into those options.
Any other questions? I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's a really good comment, and it's a great segue into the next section of this. If no one has additional questions, comments, or concerns,
go ahead.
Real quick,
Yes.
I just had one comment. This
Yeah.
is Matt Brown from Montgomery. I may have asked this when we had our first conversation a few months ago, but you made a reference to the efficiency that we have relative to our peers in other markets. But I think in the initial presentation, we also talked about them having very similar problem right now with huge funding gaps. And what are they doing to try and tackle this, and kind of how much of the federal dollars are they using? What does that amount to? I guess, how do we compare to them, and are we in the same boat or not?
speaking generally, we're all in the same boat, and folks are we're trying to solve this problem at the same. So it's not that we have any really lessons learned that we can glean from, but we see taxes being levied. We see congestion pricing in New York City, cordon pricing in New York City as a way to drive dollars to transit. But right now there's no successes that we can point to. So we're all going through this at the same time. As lessons are learned, we will definitely bake those into our considerations.
Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, next slide. So we're talking about just recently the second to last comment, service coordination and allocation of funds. That sort of gets to the heart of governance. So the next set of slides is just going to outline what we're hearing as it relates to desired governance reforms. And given the complexities surrounding issues related to governance, it's important that we as a group don't jump to predetermined solutions. Really understand exactly what we're solving for. Put that another way, are the recommendations that we propose solving the priority problems? So we at CMAP have put together some draft problem statements based upon both the feedback received from ENO with its interviews, regional stakeholders, and input from other discussions. And engaging other discussion groups in the governance discussion is critical since governance reforms may be necessary to help us achieve the system we want and recommendations around how to pay for it. So the draft problem statements are still evolving, but represent what we hear as the main concerns related to governance. Very familiar to all of us based upon some of the conversation we just had. So at the highest level, there's decision making. And this is a common theme, namely that priorities and decisions are being made in a decentralized fashion that lack in common vision and approach to execution. It's found that this problem aspects of transit governance, and those other aspects are service coordination, and the feeling that the service board specific strategies tend to focus on the interests of their own governing bodies, which hampers the vision of fully coordinated regional mobility. Further, statutorily required funding allocation model transit operations incentivize silos and lacks the flexibility to address actual and evolving needs. From an accountability standpoint, it's found that the existence of multiple governing boards with overlapping representation and different missions challenge the notion of accountability. And finally, at the state and regional of partnership with relevant state and regional entities in transit planning and funding creates funding silos and inhibits broader mobility outcomes. Next slide. So this chart reflects the way in which, under the current governance model, the issues identified in the draft problems to reinforce each other. It's sort of like a feedback loop. Under a governance model that favors local control through funding formulas and individual governing boards, accountability at the regional level for matters of coordination is challenging. Next slide. So how are these draft problems going to be used? Well, they're going to help us focus on the issues for which we're solving. The solution to those issues will be further refined using policy and process considerations. From a policy standpoint, does it meet the core tenets of the part legislation that mandates this study? Does it look to financial sustainability? How does it impact equity? What about mobility concerns? And then from a process standpoint, that basically looks at implementability. How feasible are these options? Looks at administrative feasibility, political feasibility, how long is it going to take to implement? And then also, is it within the state span of control? Mayor Bennett was talking about our audience here, which is the General Assembly. So we're going to be refining draft solutions over the coming months in this larger rubric, and we anticipate briefing you later this summer with more concrete recommendations, not only on the governance side, but the funding side, and then also how it looks for the system we want. So we have an exciting summer coming in, and that's the end of my presentation, but I will open it up for any questions, assuming we have time.
Any further questions? Thanks. Great information, and we look forward to the next report as to your movement into an ultimate recommendation. Thanks, Bill.
My pleasure.
Okay, moving on. We do have a report from Aaron, an annual report on 2022. Aaron.
Yeah, thank you so much. You received in your packet our 2022 annual report. So I'm going to touch on a few of the elements of the annual report here for you. But, as a reminder, this is one of our requirements in the Regional Planning Act, and we've had a busy year with lots of exciting work that we want to share with you, our partners, our legislators, and others. So, this report is organized around 3 focus areas of our strategic direction, which is our 5-year strategic plan that focuses on our implementation of ONTO 2050 in 3 core areas: transportation, climate, and economic competitiveness. I wanted to start off with our focus on transportation here. Again, our goal is really to provide a system that works better for everyone. These lasting challenges that we've seen post-pandemic are helping us really think about the way people and goods move throughout our region in new and meaningful ways. And we want to help support our partners in new and meaningful ways as they address these challenges locally. Again, I know we've talked with you about our mobility recovery work. which has 3 core recommendations: that we're investing in a stronger and more financially secure transit system, that we're thinking about expanding our travel by safe and active modes, and that we're thinking about how we balance the economic impacts of our e-commerce and other freight activities with local community benefits as well. Just a couple of highlights here from the year. I know that many of you know, as part of our MPO functions, we maintain the region's 5-year Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP. In 2022, our team managed over 2,000 changes to the TIP, which are your local projects. So any project that you have in your community that has federal dollars attached to it, when things change, we need to make sure that that information is updated in our TIP. We assist our 11 councils of mayors in the city of Chicago in developing projects with nearly $1 billion in surface transportation program funding over the next 5 years. And again, we're continuously evaluating our competitive programming processes, our congestion mitigation air quality improvement program, our transportation and alternatives projects, which fund really important safety, bicycle and pedestrian projects, that we're thinking about all road users and really making sure that our transportation system is resilient and also equitable. You know, currently, I know that we've talked a lot about our ADA program. Only 11% of our region has an ADA transition plan as required by Title II. It's one of the core things that we must do in this region in order to receive our federal funds. Again, we will continue to provide assistance to communities in developing ADA transition plans and providing communities with guidance for higher capacity communities that maybe don't necessarily need us to support them with a plan, but really want to make sure that they're in compliance and have others to bounce ideas off of. You know, we've achieved a federal safety grant of about $5 million to help all of our counties create safety action plans, which will unlock new federal infrastructure dollars from the infrastructure bill. We've selected over 20 communities to participate in our 2023 local technical assistance program. And then again, we've been thinking about ways in which we can build equity and more equitable outcomes in our work. So this past year, we launched a program called CARE, the Community Alliance for Regional Equity. And we are meeting with 12 community-based organizations from across the region who will contribute their expertise and their lived experience to enhance equitable planning and strengthen our community collaboration. Unlike traditional advisory works groups, CARE members will be compensated for their time with a $10,000 unrestricted stipend. And this funding is coming directly from Federal Highway Administration through IDOT. It's a unique program that we'll be excited to share more with you next year or in the next coming months. You know, climate is another area that we really have heard from you all that we need to be thinking about, and also the federal funds that are available to us really require us to think about our transportation system and the nexus of transportation and climate, as well as we think about not only just the system that we have in terms of infrastructure, but how do we make sure that we maintain high quality water resources as well. So in 2022, we updated our regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory. We created localized data snapshots for every community area in the city of Chicago and every municipality and every county. We hope that this provides you all with measured targets and a way to track your progress over time. Also focusing on economic competitiveness, we have been excited to work with all of the 7 counties in the city of Chicago to launch the Greater Chicagoland Economic Partnership. Again, this has been tried before, but I think one of the exciting things about this work right now is that we seem to have a good coordinated group of people who are dedicated to advancing this regional economic activity, so that when a company comes and says that they want to locate in the Chicagoland region, they're not being passed around from county to county and city to find the right place. That there's one point of entry, and that point is coordinating with all of the opportunities that are available across our region. So a couple other things that you'll find in the report. Again, we're always focused on community engagement here. Again, we not only work with you and our committees, but there's so many governments, our councils of mayors, our local communities, our nonprofits, and so many more. Again, our Future Leaders in Planning program had a very successful year last year, where we welcomed 20 high school students to learn about the planning field and how it shapes our region's communities. I'll just highlight that applications are open for next year's FLIP program right now. So if you know high school students or high school teachers who'd be interested, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll send them information. But again, we have been thinking a lot about internal communications and engagement, thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion internally as well to make sure that we have the workforce that can support this work and the agency, and then also bring that work out into the region. So in closing, as we look ahead to 2023 and beyond, we want to continue to address the region's challenges everywhere across our region, which includes things like the PART report that you heard, thinking about how transit can be bolstered and funding can be secured for transit, that we're thinking about traffic safety and saving lives, that we're thinking about investing in declining infrastructure, that we're improving equity and accessibility and mobility for all of our residents across the region, that we're thinking about mitigating the impacts of climate change, and then really most importantly is maintaining our region's economic position as a global economy and the nation's hub for freight and goods movement. So if you have any questions or would like copies of the annual report, I know that we're getting it out to folks right now, but this work would not be possible without you, our board. So thank you for your support and your continued participation in these regional assets and conversations that we have monthly. Happy to take any questions on the annual report if you have any.
Comments, questions? Thanks, Aaron. Staff has done a great job. This organization has done a great job, especially coming out of COVID. I mean, they look to us for how the vision is going short term, and I think we have stepped up and addressed the major issues that you've outlined regarding all aspects of quality of life in our metropolitan region. So thank you.
You are welcome. This is just, it's a pleasure to serve on behalf of this board and the region. I'm going to completely abbreviate our State of the Region Public Opinion Survey and Regional Excellence Award. So just letting my team know that they probably don't need to go through the slides on this one. I want to save a little bit of time for our Legislative Affairs report here. But essentially, you'll see in your packet, and you should have received a press release about our State of the Region and our public opinion surveys. One of the things we want to do is get a sentiment of where the public is in relationship to our 2050 plan recommendations. I think we saw some consistency between last year's public opinion poll and this year's, that residents' outlook remained fairly consistent, but I think there was increasing concern around economic issues and particularly the high cost of housing. So again, I will follow up with many of you. I know we've had some interest in the details here from communities across the region, but one of the things that we're doing differently this year is last year we held a State of the Region event here that we had, 250 people call into and had speakers and award winners. This time we're taking it on the road. So we are partnering with our COGs and our counties to actually go out. We had our first program presentation to McHenry Council of Governments in McHenry County in partnership with them last week. Really bringing this information out to the local level is something that I want to do more of and am committed to doing more of coming out of the pandemic. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. And if we are working in your part of the region, we will reach out to make sure you are not only aware of the date and time, but hopefully to have you be part of the program. So thank you for that. With that, I will, again, happy to answer questions on the public opinion survey, but recognize we're nearing the end of our time here.
I promise, Mayor, we'll be done by 11. Any questions of Aaron? All right, moving on to a legislative update. And John, I know we have some good news. So
we do. Thank you, Mayor. And
potential good news.
Yes, well, we're working towards that good news. I'll be brief. Right now, the General Assembly is nearing the end of the mid-session recess. When it reconvenes next week, they'll be working on bills from the opposite chamber and drafting a fiscal year 24 budget. The General Assembly is scheduled to adjourn on May 19th. As we noted in our last meeting, we've secured sponsors for the CMAP appropriations bills. In the Senate, Senator Ram Villabalam and Senator Don DeWitt are sponsoring Senate Bill 1429. This bill has been assigned to the Senate Appropriations Committee on Public Safety and Infrastructure. In the House, Representative Marty Moylan and Representative Dan Ugosti are sponsoring House Bill 4027. This bill is still in rules, but we expect it to be assigned to an Appropriations Committee shortly. We worked closely with our communications team to develop a fact sheet with more information on this legislation, and it'll be made available to you and distributed to you shortly. We also want to make sure the board is aware that when these bills are scheduled for a hearing, we'll make you aware of that. Our goal is to have them incorporated in the fiscal year 2024 budget, which usually doesn't take shape until towards the end of the session. On the federal side, as mentioned, the IIJA priority booklet was finalized and distributed, and we're working to promote that among legislators. As a next step, we recently distributed a survey to participants about their experience in developing the priority project list. Later this spring, we'd like to have the working group come back together to discuss what changes they might want to make for next year's booklet. One aspect that we'll be looking at is how to better include the municipal perspective in this conversation. Finally, we've reached out to our congressional delegation to remind them to coordinate with us on community project funding requests, as transportation projects need to be included in the TIP. We sent a list of TIP projects within each legislative congressional district's boundaries for congressional staff to use as reference. With that, I'm happy to take any questions, and it concludes my report.
Thanks, John. Just real quickly, I spoke to Representative Moreland to thank him for sponsoring the bill in the House, and certainly for the bill sponsored in the Senate. As you know, after all these years, the first time we're actually down there with legislation on the table regarding funding for CMAP, which was never given to us from the beginning. That's the point that's being made, certainly to the committees. And John, if there's some point in time where there is legislative hearings on committees, please let Aaron know, and if we can then distribute it to all of our partners in the region, all the mayors and counties, to send witness slips in support of both either the House or Senate bills when they come up, or in fact, if we need some people to testify down there, please let us know.
Absolutely, we'll do that. That's the plan. We're waiting to hear from both sponsors as to when the hearings will be held. These bills themselves probably won't be enacted, but this is a place saver for the upcoming budget negotiations.
Absolutely, thank you. Any questions of John? Under other business, none being, I don't think, before the board. Under public comment, Aaron, you said we have 2 public comments that were submitted, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that there were 2 public comments received in March from John Paul Jones and from a George concerned resident. They were included in the public packet and made available. We did receive 1 additional public comment from Anton Seals, the lead steward of Grow Greater Englewood, and we'll pop the letter in the chat here for you all. But essentially, the letter was sent to CMAP, and I believe also the Chicago Department of Transportation, to thank them for their support in securing $3 million in ITEP funding for the Englewood Nature Trail project, and looks forward to continued collaboration with Grow Greater Englewood as they look to improve the rail line in the Greater Englewood neighborhood that would help support economic opportunity, access to nature, wellness, wealth, and growing local economies here. Is the gist of the letter.
Thanks, Aaron. I promised 11. It's 11:01. We are meeting for the last time next month on virtually, so please also attend. And our executive committee, we do have not a large agenda, but please, for those on the executive committee, get onto the new our go-to site so we can get on with it. Other than that, I will see you all next month. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Reinbold.
Reinbold and Frank Beal, thank you.
Second, Barrington, Darch.
I'm sure you did, Mayor, on the motion. Call a roll.
Mayor Bennett?
Aye.
Frank Beal?
Aye.
President Brawley?
Yes.
Mayor Darch?
Yes.
Paul Goodrich?
Yes.
Jim Healy?
Aye.
Nina Itamudia?
Aye.
Mayor Noak?
Aye.
President Reinbold?
Yes.
Mayor Rotering?
Yes.
Stephen Schaefer? Carolyn Schofield?
Yes.
Ann Sheehan? Matt Walsh?
Yes.
Diane Williams?
Yes.
The motion carries. Please enjoy the beautiful summer weather, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.